Some movies leave a lasting impression on its viewers, and The Exorcist, released in 1973, was no exception. But it wasn't just the vile and shocking nature of the scenes that made this movie so historic. It was the fact that the tormented young girl depicted in the film was based on an actual person. With Hollywood having turned this tale into a cult classic, most assume that the movie is far worse than what could have actually transpired in real life. However, this couldn't be farther from the truth. The real case has chilling claims of supernatural phenomena, malevolent spirits, and witnesses to corroborate it all. One final plot twist: unlike in the movie, it wasn't a girl that had these experiences, but a boy. This is the possession of Ronald Hunkeler.
Welcome to the second episode of Hosting Evil. I'm Jess.
And I'm Emily, and I'm here to give you one of the greatest stories of demonic possession. Jess, I hope you're just as ready as our listeners.
Emily, I am so ready.
So Ronald Hunkeler was born in 1935. His parents, Edwin and Odell, were from St. Louis, Missouri originally, but he was born in Washington, D.C., where his dad had a job. Ronald, his parents, and his paternal grandmother were living in Cottage City, Maryland, not far from Washington, when the events surrounding this possession began in January 1949.
Yeah.
But this is where it begins. So at the time, Ronald was only 13 years old. He was an only child, and he was referenced as being quiet and not very good at making friends his own age. There's many sources that suggest that he was very close to his father's sister, his Aunt Tilly. And Aunt Tilly is significant to the story, and we'll see for multiple reasons. But the biggest thing is that she was a practicing spiritualist, and she taught Ronald some of these beliefs, including how to use the Ouija board. So if you don't know, spiritualism is a religious movement that's based on the belief that spirits of the dead exist and have both the ability and the desire to communicate with the living. So things started to happen in the Hunkeler home on January 15th, 1949. Ronald's parents were out, so it was just him and his grandmother hanging out together, and they began hearing noises that were coming from his grandmother's room. So at first they could hear dripping sounds.
Like water?
Yeah, like a dripping pipe or something, like something explainable,
Okay.
but like a water drip, which I can't stand the sound of a dripping faucet.
No, I would hear that right away.
So I would die.
Want to find the source.
Yeah, but then they were also hearing scratching sounds that sounded like they were coming from her bed or maybe even under her bed.
Oh my gosh.
And there was also a picture of Jesus that they had in the home that shook on the wall as if the wall had been hit. So they're freaked out.
As one would be.
Yep. And so Ronald's parents come home and they hear the noises too.
Wait, is this after the Ouija board?
Yeah,
came
so
into the home?
he's learned, yeah.
So he knows what that is. He's probably
Yes.
played around with it.
Yes.
Enter creepy noises in the house. Got
Exactly.
it. Okay.
It's, there's no proof like he played with the Ouija board on Sunday and these noises started Tuesday. Nothing
Right.
like that. But
Speculation.
there's definitely some speculation that there's a connection.
Right.
So the family's first response, though, was a reasonable one, and they decided to call a plumber and an exterminator. So they came to the house and they discovered that there were no leaky pipes or mice running under the floorboard. But the noises continued for a number of days, and then one day they had just stopped. Now, in the midst of all of this, about 2 weeks after the noises had started, Aunt Tilly died from multiple sclerosis in
gosh.
St. Louis. And she was probably about 50 years old. She had her own family, so it was definitely, I'm sure, really hard on the family, but also really hard on Ronald.
Yeah, they
because
were so close.
it seems like they were really close. So when that happened, the noises moved to Ronald's room.
Of course they did.
Right. So he would hear a noise that would sound like shoes squeaking, as if someone was walking back and forth along the side of his bed.
Oh,
At this time, Ronald, his mother, and grandmother were starting to wonder if the noises were coming from Aunt Tilly, trying to contact them from the other side. So they would do what a lot of spiritualists do, where they would question the presence and to see if there was a knock.
mm.
And so, they would ask these questions, they would hear a knock and they would say, "Is it Aunt Tilly?" to try and prove. And they heard the knocks, like they heard what they were looking for.
So like knock twice if it's yes, knock once if it's no type of
Yeah.
thing.
Or if you're Aunt Tilly, knock 3 times.
Gotcha.
So that would happen. But then they were starting to hear scratching coming from within Ronald's bed.
You mean like
Like,
in the mattress?
yeah, like if something was in the mattress.
Ooh.
And supposedly it was continuous. And if they weren't like noticing it or commenting that it was happening or like paying attention to it, the mattress would start to shake.
Like, pay attention to me.
Yeah, like this is definitely, we're gonna see like a temperamental force.
Spirit. Oh my gosh.
Something's going on.
That's fun.
But it's also a little sketchy too, because like Aunt Tilly died after the noises originally started. So when they were like, "Oh, well, is this Aunt Tilly?" But I mean,
Yeah, if this was starting before she died,
yeah,
I mean, you're kind of just,
reaching.
yeah, I think it's a stretch to say that it's her coming to visit.
Yeah. So they also even wondered if it was a poltergeist in the house. And so a poltergeist is considered a new noisy, usually mischievous ghost that's held responsible for unexplained noises and disturbances, but it's in a specific location. All of these ideas made sense because it was all going on within the house. But then the events followed Ronald outside of their home.
Uh-oh.
So it was reported in school that his desk moved, that he moved while in his desk.
Wait, so students and teachers saw this?
Yes.
Oh my
And
gosh.
he, from what I understand, like he was really embarrassed and even withdrew from school
Oh my gosh.
because of this. And one time they were visiting like a friend's house, a family friend's house, and people witnessed him spinning in a chair like a top. And the adults that were at this get together, they even tried to like replicate it. And they couldn't. But I mean, it makes you laugh because I feel like they were very reasonable.
Yeah, they're trying to debunk what they're seeing.
Yeah. And I mean, so even, compared to Annalise, it's a little bit different because it's a different time period.
Yep.
This is 1949 and America, but still, it's like, they're like, well,
There's
how
got to
can
be a
we figure
reasonable
this out?
explanation for this.
Yeah. So when all of this was happening, the Hunkeler family decided to contact their Lutheran pastor, Reverend Luther Miles Schultz. So I didn't mention this earlier. They were practicing German Lutherans.
Okay.
That was their faith. And so it's important to note, though, that the Lutheran faith does not believe or have any way to deal with the concept of diabolical possession. And actually, the rite of exorcism, like what we saw come up in Annalise's story, is known for casting out demons. It was a Catholic ritual. It is a Catholic ritual.
So they only dealt with like the light and the good part of things.
Well, so what happened was like when Lutheranism split from Roman Catholicism, like many other split offs like Protestantism, for example, they didn't carry over a lot of the rituals because it was seen as like extra or unnecessary.
It's extra.
So in a sense, they were like, no, we don't need that.
Too much fluff.
Yeah.
Just get to the principles.
So they don't really have an answer for it. And there's other Christian faiths that it'll definitely come up in future cases where like they, even if you have the Christian faith, sometimes the Christian faiths don't always have like an answer.
No, they do not.
Or a response.
Right.
So Reverend Schultz is one of them, and he felt like the best reaction was to deal with these happenings with prayer and contempt. So that meant that the family prayed at home. He would pray in his own home, and then they would also make requests for prayers for Ronald at church. So In the meantime, though, like, things are going on, there's noises. Then the Reverend asked that Ronald spend the night in his home to witness what was going on.
Okay. You know where my mind goes with this. There was a lot, happening with priests and
Yeah,
children.
definitely sketchy. I mean, but wait,
But we
because
digress,
he gets
okay.
his answer, though.
Gotcha.
That's the great he gets his answer. So, while Ronald is spending the night at the Reverend's home, the Reverend started to hear clawing sounds coming from, like, in the room that they were in, and he started to pray. But every time he would begin to pray, it would, like, actively happen stronger. And even, like, I think at one minute they said that Ronald was sitting in a chair and the chair flipped over. Like, as if,
Like that
like,
unforeseen force we were talking about
exactly, like how
with Annalise.
Annalise was getting thrown into the ground, like Ronald was getting pushed in the chair.
Wow.
And this happens. This is going to happen a lot. So, Schultz, still being a man of reason, still without a belief in an exorcism, he advised the family to take Ronald to a physician and a psychiatrist. Reportedly, the family did, but there were no recorded findings from the medical field, and he was just considered to be normal. But it's also important, like, you have to remember what time period this is. So, at that time, psychological differences were still not well understood. And at the time, electric and insulin shock were the most common response to these disorders. And there's also a huge stigma that surrounds mental illness, and even in some
Still is,
cases
yeah.
today. Yeah. So, I mean, I could imagine that his parents kind of were given these options and decided to not push forward because,
He's 13.
yeah, why would you pick
Like,
that?
you don't want to have your child be labeled
Mentally ill.
Yeah.
Yeah. And also too, I mean, I think that they were trying to argue, like, is this just a adolescent boy or, a preteen acting out?
Right.
But we'll see that it's not.
No, I'm gonna
It's not going
assume that
we'll
it's
see
not
that
that
it's not.
thing.
So, there's still a significant part to the possession of Ronald that is important, and it's important in almost every case of a possession, which is the number of witnesses. And so in Ronald's case, I mean, he had his immediate family. He had, a second layer, a second bubble of family and friends, people in school. And even if the minister and even if the doctors didn't necessarily agree, they still said that there was, like, something going on.
Yeah, they might not have had a label or a term for it, but if it wasn't under the umbrella of what they already had,
Yeah.
then I think that that's where the eyebrow raise comes in.
Right. And by February 26, scratches and claws started to appear on his entire body. Some looked like letters, but didn't form words. And it seemed that the force that had been pestering Ronald and his family had now moved within him.
Just like Annalise.
Yeah, so kind of like how she started by smelling the smell, and then it
became
her. It was like, they were hearing the scratching sounds, but now the scratches are on him.
Ugh.
So after the marks appeared on Ronald, they go back to the minister, and that's when he says, okay, fine, go talk to a Catholic priest. So Ronald's father called a priest at the local parish, St. James, which was a nearby Catholic church, and he meets Father Albert Hughes. So, and this is also a time where, like, cross religion, like, doesn't really happen,
No, it doesn't, yeah.
So the priest promised to pray and gave them holy water and candles that were specially blessed to be used at the church's altar, but he was also still kind of keeping his distance. So Ronald's mother reported that the next day in the house, the bottle was seen to be picked up by an unseen force and smashed. And then when she attempted to to light the candles, the flames shot up to the ceiling and had to be extinguished in fear that they would catch on
Oh my
fire.
gosh. So there was definitely a reaction there.
Yes, yeah. And it's not just Ronald
Yeah, no,
that's
it's the
seeing
family
it.
that's
Yeah.
seeing it and experiencing it.
There's also one version of the story where Ronald met the priest and he said to the priest in Latin, "O priest of Christ, you know that I am the devil. Why do you keep bothering me?"
So Ronald said that in Latin
Ronald
to the
said that
priest.
in Latin to the priest.
So this 13-year-old boy is just picking up Latin.
Yes,
Mm.
theoretically.
Yep.
Yeah. And so I will say, so for people who aren't familiar with Roman Catholic history, at that time in 1949, the entire mass was said in Latin, but Ronald wasn't Catholic.
No, he was not.
He was not going to Catholic masses. And I'm pretty sure that the Lutherans did theirs in English at that time.
Yeah, why
so, yeah. So, anyway, anytime that the family was experiencing any of these strange events, they would pray, but they always found that prayer angered the force. So Ronald plunged deeper into his spells. And so I'm going to use some terms that you've used. Spells, trance, they come up a lot.
So he would go under these trance like for
States,
long periods of time
yeah.
too.
Maybe not even long periods. We'll get to it. But in a sense, like during these states, it was almost like maybe he was asleep. Like Ronald was asleep, but his body wasn't, you know?
Mm.
So the family started to consider returning to St. Louis because they knew that they had a support system there and they hoped that a new setting would make a difference. Then one night, Ronald screamed in pain and was trembling, and they found that scratched on his chest was just the word Lewis. His mother told him that they would go, but it was going to require planning. And then the word Saturday appeared on his hip.
So he's having full words in scratches show up on his body.
Yes. And their questions to whatever force is within Ronald is being answered.
Right.
Because then the mother asked, for how long?
Oh, so she's using her son as like a Ouija board at this
Yeah,
point. Got it. Cool.
basically, or like in Stranger Things with the lights.
Yeah.
Yeah, except it's her son's body. Yeah.
She's like, hold the phone. Let's ask some more questions.
Right? So she asked for how long, and 3.5 appeared on his skin, assuming that that meant 3.5 weeks. It's crazy. And when this happened, they're still consulting people. So they still consulted their minister, Reverend Schultz, and they saw a doctor. Now, both the doctor and the reverend said that they couldn't see words. It's like, you must be making this up. But the physician did acknowledge that there was a nerve reaction that appeared to look like scratches. Okay, but still, this is like a 13-year-old boy. Why is he getting a nerve reaction?
That's crazy.
And scratches on the body or marks, those are one of the things, it's like one of those common signs or symptoms of possession.
Well, even in, when people are doing their ghost hunting,
yes,
a lot of times scratches will appear, especially if it's, a more negative force that they're dealing with.
Right. So they were still also working though with Father Hughes. And so Father Hughes was convinced that they needed an exorcism, but he had to receive permission from the ordinary, similar to Annalise. So the ordinary would weigh the evidence and then decide whether to allow an exorcism to be performed or not. But at the same time that he was trying to get that permission, the family was like, that's it. we're going to St.
We're
Louis.
out of here.
Yeah. So that was kind of like phase 1. So on Saturday, March 5th, the family boards a train for St. Louis. Their first few days there, they stayed with family. Well, really, they stayed with family the whole time, but they would kind of move around between their different family members just because, like, on the mom and dad side, there were so many people that lived there. And so, again, they're going and they're staying with family, and there's even more people that are witnesses.
There's no shortage of witnesses in this case.
No,
That's for sure.
it's endless. So their Catholic family members are encouraging them to get a priest for an exorcism. And so they reach out to this Jesuit priest, Raymond Bishop, who had witnessed these events. And I think he was a family friend. So Father Bishop had to confer with other priests in order to receive the permission to perform an exorcism, the same way that the priest in Maryland was trying to do. So he brought in William Bowdern, and he was another Jesuit and a pastor of the college church in St. Louis, and he came and observed Ronald and blessed him with a relic and blessed the house. But they were continuing to have problems. And so it was like, Ronald is being tortured by this unseen force. Any bed that he was sleeping in would literally move, and the scratching remained. So imagine, like, as a kid, you're visiting your cousin's house, and you guys are like having a sleepover, and you're laying in a bed that's literally just moving
Oh my.
around. Like, can you imagine how insane?
I was scared to like go walk the hall at night, even though I wasn't in any type of haunted situation. I
Right,
could
yeah.
not imagine
Yeah.
what that must have been like for not only Ronald, but anyone that was in the vicinity. I'm sure, and they probably heard the mother talk about this, but like
Yeah.
once you see it,
Right.
it's a whole different story.
Yeah. And that the scratching is remaining, like the sound. So people are hearing things, but Ronald's really the victim of all of it. So by March 16th, the Archbishop of St. Louis granted Father Bowdern permission to perform the exorcism. And that very night, Bowdern, Father Bishop, and a third priest, Walter Halloran, they all go to the house and they start the prayers of exorcism. In the midst of this, Ronald's body was scratched and the word hell appeared on his chest. And then an image of the devil that almost looked like a bat showed up on his legs. And so during the time where they're performing the exorcism and they're reading through the prayers, his body is being marked, but it's not like you don't see a pen scratching him, you don't see the mark, they just appear. So overall that night, he was covered with over 25 marks.
Oh my gosh.
So the priests take turns reading the prayers, and there were times when Ronald appeared to be asleep peacefully, but when the priest started to say the prayers to St. Michael, Ronald smiled and laughed, even though he had not woken up, and his body moved in the bed as if he was fighting with an unknown force. And this was a new symptom of his possession that was terrifying.
I can only imagine what that looked like.
Right. Yeah, it looks like you're asleep and you're like fighting
Writhing?
somebody.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So the only way that they could wake him up was by throwing holy water on him or at him. And this will go on for his entire possession.
Oh my goodness.
So while awake, he said that he dreamed that he was fighting a huge red slimy devil who was preventing him from getting through an iron gate at the top of a pit or a cave. And he said that it was very hot, but that he wanted to fight. And he also mentioned that there were smaller devils or demons present. So, and that's the other thing, the heat. And I think you might have even talked about that with Annalise. But with Ronald, every time that he's in this like trance or when he's not awake, so to speak, when he would wake up, he would ask for water and he would explain like how hot he was, how uncomfortable the entire time. So when the priest continued with their prayers, he fell back into a tantrum state, and his body continued to fight the unseen force. Even two family members tried to pin him down so that the rites could continue. And you have to remember, like Annalise, Ronald was a pretty small boy. I
Yeah, he
mean,
wasn't like a full-fledged man or even
no,
teenager
he
yet.
was 13, but I mean, there's pictures. He looks like he was probably a small
Mm.
13-year-old.
But again, we're seeing that strength.
Exactly. Exactly. So when they had tried to calm him so that they could continue the rites, he would shout threats and spit at his own family members, but it wasn't really him, because whenever they would bring him out of the trance, he would always complain of the heat, ask for water, and they would have to tell him what he was doing.
Yeah,
Like
they
he
don't have
wouldn't
any
even
knowledge.
know. Yeah, so it wasn't like with how, like it wasn't like he was there sometimes, like he was completely out of
Mhm.
it. So the final phase of the exorcism that night is another odd part of a lot of possessions. Ronald started to sing in a very high-pitched voice at a loud volume two songs, Swanee and Old Man River, with very dramatic arm gestures. And these are like old-timey
Yeah, I was
songs.
gonna
Like they weren't
say,
even contemporary to Ronald. So like that's
that
creepy.
is the creepiest visual.
That's really creepy. That would be like if your kid like all of a sudden was singing like "Meet Me in St. Louis,"
Oh my god.
but like with a really weird
Well,
tone,
and yeah, his voice is completely it's like funny because Annalise would have this deep voice and he's having this high
high
pitched.
pitched
Why the heck
voice.
didn't they put that in the movie?
Right? I know. So that was happening, and it gets to the point where like the priest kept going, and then Ronald finally fell asleep at 7:30 that morning, and he was able to sleep until 1. But the crazy thing with Ronald is that when he would wake up during the days, he would be fine. Like he would be kind of normal. So they even commented that that day when he woke up, he ate a meal, played Monopoly with his family, and like at one point they were like, like playing catch. And it's also weird because it's kind of like if you don't have family that lives near you, you know what it is to like go visit your aunts and your cousins, and you don't get to see them all the time. You're there for some days. So you're really
Taking it all in and
taking it all in and
doing stuff.
taking time to bond
Sure.
with one another. So they were doing that during the day, but,
But then, sundown, whole nother story.
yeah.
Oh, that's interesting that he didn't have daytime episodes
Not
at this
really.
point.
Not at this point, no. The night of March 19th, the priest began the rites, and Ronald began to bark and snap his teeth like a dog.
Annalise did
I
the
know.
same freaking thing.
Yep. At one point during the rite, the priest asked for a sign, and then Ronald began to urinate
Oh
uncontrollably.
my gosh.
So what's also weird though is like they're asking for signs. Ronald's not in control.
No.
So
Doesn't sound like it at all.
the demon is doing what it can do. When he was awake, he complained that it burned. So he knew that he had urinated, and I guess his urine was hot, which is also like an extra really gross level to all of
That
this.
is terrible.
But I definitely think they worked that into The Exorcist really well with like
Yes, they did. Yes, the bodily functions. Yeah.
Yep. So we see where it came from
Yep.
now. So during his tantrum, he antagonized the priest, and at one point he began to sing a song so perfectly, but when he was actually awake, he couldn't even carry the tune and he didn't even know the song. So it's weird because it's like you talked about, knowing different languages.
Yep.
And here the demon, the devil that's possessing him is like
Showing off vocally.
yeah, showing off like his pop culture knowledge or
That is
something.
crazy. Well, and it also probably would beg, someone would say that maybe it's because it's two different demons going about it two
Right.
different ways.
Yeah, exactly. So by March 21st, they decided to take him to a hospital in St. Louis that was run by the Alexian brothers. And they're a Catholic order that they're dedicated to the sick. So they often have hospitals. However, the night that they took him to the hospital, nothing outstanding happened. So the next day, they just took him back to his uncle's home. And there's actually numerous times when whatever was possessing Ronald, it knew that it was messing with people.
Yeah,
And
it
it
was
would
being
do
watched.
it. Yeah. And even one night, it made them believe that the demon had left.
Mm.
And
That
they had him
trickery.
open up the window. Yeah. The trickery, exactly. So that's kind of, I think, what was going on with when they took him to the hospital. But then, so on March 23rd, the priest got Ronald a room at the college church rectory, and that's where Father Bowden was. So Ronald began to take Catholic religious instruction, because that's the other thing. They're doing all of these Catholic things around him, but like he doesn't even know it,
Right,
you
he's
know,
never
or he
was
doesn't
taught.
know anything about it.
He knows the Ouija board, the end.
Yeah, exactly. So when the priest started the rites that night, he began to kick and fight. And when they started the litany, which is a section of the rites, and that's when they name like the names of the saints, he broke Father Holleran's nose and actually made another priest that was there, that was present, he caused his nose to bleed.
Oh my gosh. So again, that violence.
Yep, exactly. And when he was awake, he had no idea that he was doing this. And even too, like, he wasn't really capable of that. Like, this wasn't the boy that his family knew. And again, going back into his trance, he would urinate, he would fart, he would spit, curse, and then he would also talk about his own genitals. He would also talk about the priest's genitals. And when he would wake up, they would question him about it. And he said that the men that he saw when he was in this state of a trance, they were using that filthy language. Because this wasn't like the language of his family. It's not like he grew up with like, he wasn't in Hell's Angels.
No, and you know, the demons, you know, in all of these cases we will, you know, talk about, demons love the shock value.
Yes.
And they often use bodily functions. They talk about genitalia. They have
Yes.
the possessed person talk about that for that very reason. Because what does it do? It makes people uncomfortable and they want to run.
Yep. So at one point, when Ronald was awake from a tantrum, he actually told one of the priests that was present that he met him in hell, and it was in 1957. So in the future. So the demons that are within, or the demon, because in this case it's technically singular, they're screwing with everyone.
Oh yeah, they love to
Yeah,
do
they
that.
love
Get inside your
to.
head.
Yeah. So the next night, there was similar trauma. He shouted, he screamed, he barked, he sang.
In that order.
Yeah, pretty much. There was a break in his possession, and the priest and Ronald and his family hoped that it meant that he was getting better and that he was getting freed. And so for a few nights, there were actually no events. So it's weird with Ronald. Unlike Annalise, which happened over a long period of time, his possession takes place over just a few short months, but there were breaks within those months.
So he had reprieve.
Yes, but how great that reprieve
Yeah.
was, you know, who knows. And so on March 31st, the force returned. And at this point, we have to remember, Ronald and his family have been dealing with all of this on and off for 76 days.
They must have been absolutely, I don't even know the word that you would describe, dysfunctional at this point.
Yeah, they were kind of like prisoners, you know, to this
You
demon.
can't live your life.
Even it was affecting Ronald. And the other thing too, that like it didn't really come up, but I had to wonder. I was like, what was his father doing?
Yeah.
Like, who went to work? Like,
How
who's
did they
paying their
survive?
bills? Yeah. So anyway, Ronald complained that he was feeling ill, and that's when the spells began. So that night, while he starts feeling ill, he asks for a pencil and he started to write numerous things on his sheets. And the family was actually encouraging this. And they even put up like large sheets of wrapping paper kind of around his bed for him to write on.
So he was channeling.
Yes, and he was writing all of these things, and some of which include. So he said, this demon was saying, I will stay 10 days and then return when the 4 days are up. I am the devil himself. You will have to pray for a month in the Catholic Church. You may not believe me, then Ronald will suffer forever. And to Father Bishop, he said, all people that mangle with me will die a terrible death.
Threats.
Threats, yeah, exactly. And also, like not very coherent to some extent, but that uncontrollable channeling. And that comes up in other cases.
Yeah.
So as a result of this intense night, Ronald and his family decided that he would be baptized in the Catholic Church. And they brought in the priest that night. They called him up and they're like, yeah, something weird's going on.
Get over here right now.
So the priest showed up and they're doing the rites, and this is all going on with him writing. So at this point, they're like, okay, we need a new plan. We need a new way to attack this. So they had originally said that Ronald would make the decision for himself about his own faith, but now and I'm sure he probably agreed. They're like, okay, let's get Ronald into the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
our
only way out.
Lutherans aren't really helping us. So in order to do that, they were going to drive him to the college church. And in the midst of driving him there, and we can assume that this is during the day, he fell into a spell and began saying, so you're going to baptize me, followed by evil laughter. He then attempted to grab the steering wheel and had to be subdued, and his father and uncle had to hold him down in the back seat of the car while his aunt and mom were there trying to drive him. And he even tried to attack his aunt while he's being held down.
Oh, so he had that extreme force wanting to cause chaos.
Yes. And also wanting to do, trying to prevent
the baptism.
Yeah, exactly. So when they arrived, he shouted and spit, and it was nearly impossible to get him out of the trance. And when they were finally able to baptize him, they immediately followed it with the rites of exorcism. And so they were able to baptize him, but as soon as they started the rites again, his usual behaviors of spitting, cursing, jerking about, it all continued. So when he awoke the next day, he was not calm, but the priests continued their attempts for him to receive the holy sacraments, because now they're like, okay, let's go. Let's really get him to become a Catholic right now. So he continued to fight and spit out the Eucharist as they attempted to give him his first Holy Communion. Eventually, they were able to get Ronald to accept and swallow the Eucharist after they prayed the rosary. Then the priest attempted to return him to his family, but while they were in the car, he then tried to attack the priest.
Oh my gosh.
So, and also, I don't know why they were even trying to move him so much, but
keep him there.
They get him to the home. His spells continued, and there was no intervention and no change in him, no matter what they were doing. Both the family and the priest were exhausted from all the fighting too, because like you mentioned, I can't imagine the emotional labor that this was.
And the physical labor of holding this kid with crazy force back or down.
Right. So Ronald would go through periods of normalcy, but there were still constant spells where he lacked consciousness. At some point, they made the decision to return to Maryland, which again, I don't understand why, and it wasn't explained. And they would eventually go back to St. Louis. But even in Maryland, some crazy things happen. So the one priest, Father Bowdern, he traveled with them to make sure that things were going to be okay. What are you going to do? Perform an exorcism on a train?
Yeah.
But
with all these people.
Whatever. And I can only imagine that, like, maybe his family members in St. Louis were
Like,
like,
"We need a break. We need a break.
"Yeah,
Go away."
we thought we were gonna help you, but we need a new bed. We
Yeah, I
need a
mean,
new mattress from everything." So they get back to home in Maryland, and Father Bowdern, who's there, he's trying to work with Father Hughes, who I mentioned earlier, and they were looking for a hospital to continue the exorcism. And Father Hughes had permission to perform the exorcism there. So, if they could find a hospital, they were going to be able to do it. But the issue was that they couldn't find a hospital for him to go to where he didn't have to be like signed in
mm,
officially, and they were doing everything they could to prevent that. Like, they were trying to not use his real name.
yeah, I mean, he's a minor at this point.
Right.
It's traumatizing, and they're thinking
Yeah.
about what that would do if it got out into the community that this was happening to him.
Right. So basically they decided that it wasn't going to happen in Maryland. Like, Maryland wasn't going to be the answer. And so they actually take him back to St. Louis, and that's where he's readmitted into the Alexian Brothers Hospital. So now it's April 11th, and this begins a track of major events. Like, everything before wasn't crazy enough. This is where it's kind of getting heightened. So while the priests were saying the rosary, Ronald felt a pain, and the word exit appeared on his chest 3 different times. He cried and screamed, but his body constantly protested whenever they were trying to give him Holy Communion. And they were trying to do anything to stop these fits. But in a sense, like, every fit that they created a break in, then started up
Yeah.
another one. The nights continued, and there were moments where the devil possessing Ronald would say things that were very deceiving. In one fit, Ronald spoke and said that God commanded him to leave at 11 p.m., meaning the devil, but that he would not go without a fight. However, when 11 p.m. came, nothing changed. So the devil knows that they're tired,
Yep.
and he's using that. Now, what's weird is there were no disturbances on Holy Thursday, Good Friday, or Holy Saturday. That's the 14th through the 16th of April. Of course, significant days in Roman Catholicism. But Easter night, Ronald's bad behavior continued or returned. And then Monday, April 18th, was the crescendo. When he awoke that morning, he was already in a spell, kicking and fighting and screaming. He refused the communion as the devil would speak through him and laugh and threaten that he'll always be with the boy. So the devil's really coming through and speaking to these priests.
So was his voice distorted?
Yeah, it was definitely different. Like, you knew, that's the thing, like, whenever Ronald was in the spells, you knew that Ronald wasn't present. It wasn't like with Annalise where, like, she could sometimes speak through it and also be present. Like, he was completely shut off. But what you are starting to get is that when he would wake up, he would talk about what he was seeing, and he was able to do more with the priests. So they said that during the intermittent violence, they were able to actually have him say the rosary or have him say some prayers. But when they were doing the rites of the exorcism, they were trying to get Ronald to reply to them in Latin, and the devil would repeatedly refuse to. And he said something like, "I'm not speaking in the language that you demand." Like, this is my game.
I'm in control
Yeah,
here.
I'm in control, and
I
you're
call the
all just
shots.
playing. Yeah, exactly. So they continued to pray as Ronald bounced between this trance-like state. And in one moment, his voice calmly broke through in a commanding tone. So this is how you know that, like, every time before when he was talking, it wasn't his voice. And then they heard him say, "Satan, Satan, I am Saint Michael, and I command you, Satan, and every other evil spirit to leave the body in the name of Dominus immediately." And then with force he said, "Now, now, now." After minutes of violent contortions that were the worst that they had seen the entire period of exorcism, Ronald finally spoke and said, "He's gone."
And they knew that this was probably true this time.
Like building up, building up, building up, because now they finally heard his voice. So then Ronald explained to them what he saw. He said he saw a brilliant white light, and in that light there was a beautiful man with flowing, wavy hair that blew in the breeze. He wore a white robe that was fitted to his body. Ronald could only see the man's upper body, but he saw that in his right hand he held a wavy and fiery sword in front of him, and with his left hand he pointed down towards a pit or a cave, the same pit that he had mentioned before. In the pit was the devil, and Ronald could feel the heat and flames that he had witnessed so many nights. The devil fought this man, or in some ways an angel, resisting his efforts. But the angel spoke to Ronald, but all that Ronald could hear was the word Dominus, and that was the only word that he could understand. As the angel spoke, the devil and some of his helpers, the small demons or devils mentioned earlier, they began to return into the depth of the pit. As they left, Ronald could see the letter spite that had appeared on those bars that were on the outside. So, I mean, this is like a very in-depth description, like very deep imagery.
Yeah, he definitely was having some very detailed visions
Yeah.
while he was in these trances, it sounds like.
So, as the devil and his helpers disappeared, Ronald felt a tugging and a pulling on his stomach that was followed by a snapping. And for the first time since January 15th, he felt relief. At midnight that night, Ronald led a saying of the rosary with the priests that were present. He was the most composed and peaceful that they had ever seen him. And the next day, he woke up and attended his first Holy Mass since becoming a Catholic. So Ronald went on to live a normal life. Edwin, Odell, and Ronald, they all returned to Maryland and they moved forward. His parents eventually converted to Catholicism the following year. And so, as we mentioned before, for many years, there were so many rumors about who this victim was of the possession in Maryland and St. Louis. But now we know that Ronald went on to live a normal life. He attended high school and college, and he became a NASA engineer and even patented a special technology to make space shuttle panels resistant to extreme heat, helping the Apollo missions of the 1960s.
Well, because he knows all about heat at this point.
Right?
That is crazy.
But yeah, and so I mean, supposedly, like, he lived in fear that people would know that it was him who was the victim of this. And
I'm
that's
surprised it didn't get out. Because how does that not slip up one night when you've had a little too much to drink?
Well, supposedly that Reverend Schultz, like, went and spread his name around, and that was like a really big deal that happened some years later, which, like, that guy sounds like an asshole.
Yeah, why would you do that?
Yeah, but that's the thing, like, for so long, and the priests that were involved, like, they were super protective, and a lot of my information actually came from a diary that was kept by one of the priests. But what I thought was really crazy is that there's 2 diaries by 2 of the other Jesuit priests that were there that are not available for the public, and they're locked up in the archives of those orders.
I wonder if, since he's passed and it came out of who he was, if that would ever see the light of day.
I don't know, maybe.
So, Emily, question for you. Do you think that this case was true possession?
Yeah.
I mean, how could you not?
Right? I mean, how could you not? Just because, like, so many ridiculous things. But also, too, I kind of believe it just for the fact that, like, he wasn't Catholic. It's not like he knew all this stuff. It's not like he had history with all of this. Whereas, like, for Annalise, like, that good and evil was a reality that she knew
Yeah,
of.
they lived it. They ate, slept,
Yeah.
breathed religion, and so
Right.
it came natural to, have those 2 components a part of her case, at least.
And even if that family wasn't, even if, even let's say the Hunklers were, like, some kind of religious, it's still, I mean, like, there's too many people saw that. Too
Oh,
many
the
people
eyewitness,
witnessed
which is
that.
also crazy how it never came out that so many people saw and knew of him.
I
That's
know.
insane. Yeah, because he was known as Roland Doe to us up until, what, just a few months ago? Or
Literally,
Robbie
yeah.
Mannheim, was it? The
Right,
other
yeah.
pseudonym? That's crazy. Well, good for the family for keeping that
I
under lock.
know,
Well, they
right?
probably didn't want to be associated maybe
No.
with it either. Wow, that is crazy.
Right?
That is such a crazy story.
We're
I
gonna
can't get over it.
we're gonna finish every episode with, "That was such a crazy
Baffled,
story."
baffled. Thanks so much for joining us on this episode of Hosting Evil. For more information on this case and others, you can visit our website at hostingevilpodcast.com.
And don't forget to check us out on social media at Hosting Evil Podcast.
Until next time, I'm Jess. Peace, love, and light.
And I'm Emily. Keep fighting those demons.
Hosting Evil is recorded and produced by Carly Strange at Rockdale Studios.